Well, hey everyone, and welcome to module number 1 of our practical preaching course. I pray that you find this module and this course overall really beneficial to help you preach better sermons. And to begin, we need to begin at the pivotal part of understanding our audience so that we can better connect with them. Particularly for this module, we're going to give you 3 reasons why you should understand and consider your audience while preaching. And here's the first thing. Here's the point number 1 that we're going to start with. That understanding who you are preaching to will determine how you preach. Understanding who you are preaching to will determine how you preach. Let me give you kind of maybe an extreme example to really put this into focus. If you are preaching to people who speak French, and let's say you only know how to speak Spanish, well, you already know you're not going to be very effective in communicating the gospel and the Bible and really communicating at all. And so we need to understand who's coming to our churches, who we're actually speaking to, so that we can prepare sermons that will actually connect with them. You know, so often we can be like, well, I'm just going to preach the Bible, and whoever comes, they just need to love God and learn from what I'm saying. And what we need to understand is, no, as preachers, as leaders, God is calling us to lead people into a relationship with Him. And so we need to do the hard work of understanding who is coming, so that we can connect with them better. Like, for example, if you were to give a talk to a group of elementary age students, well, you would prepare much differently than you were if you were to give a talk or a sermon or a message to a group of adults. And so we need to understand and be thinking strategically and intentionally about who is coming so that we can preach to them. This may sound obvious, but I think this is something that we often forget. That we need to understand who is coming, is that will help determine how we preach and what we say. Which leads us to point number 2, which is actually more of a question. And that question is, who are you preaching to? Who actually do you want to preach to? Here's the great thing about preaching is that it actually plays a big role in who actually shows up. So who is it that you actually want to show up? I'm assuming that you want believers and non-believers alike to be coming into your church. After all, at New City Church, we believe this, and you might believe something similar, that the church is the gathering of the saints, and so we preach to believers, knowing that there are non-believers in the room, and that affects how we preach. Let me give you some examples. If you use biblical words, maybe there's some big biblical words in the passage that you're teaching, like atonement or sanctification. Well, the average person doesn't use that in day-to-day language, and so they may not understand what it means. And so if we don't take the time to explain what it means, eventually you'll have a room full of people who either really know the Bible or like big words, but not people who maybe aren't Christians or have questions because they will feel out of place. They'll assume if you don't explain something that everybody else knows what's going on but them, so maybe they shouldn't be here. Or I'll give you another example. John chapter 11 is the story of Jesus raising Lazarus. And so that can be a well-known example, and so you may not feel the need to have to explain what is going on. But if you don't explain what is going on with even explaining who is Lazarus, who is Jesus, who is Mary and Martha, Lazarus' sisters, then people who do not have the context going in will feel like they are out of place, like they don't belong, or kind of like they're too dumb to be here. And so what we want to do is we want to use words that are in the Bible, we want to explain the Bible, but we want to give context so that we can bring everyone along with us. Who do you want to preach to? Which goes to point number 3 and kind of flows really easily from point number 2. But how you preach affects who will come. How you preach affects who will come, which goes back to the question, who do you want to preach to? Who do you actually want to come to your church? Again, I think a lot of us would say we want mature believers, we want immature believers, and we want non-believers. We want everybody to come. And so how you preach affects that. Now, you may be listening to this, for example, and say, well, I lead a church where I know everybody's name. Let's say it's a small church, and I know everyone's a Christian, but I want non-Christians to feel welcome, and I want the people who come to my church to invite their non-Christian friends. But I feel uncomfortable or awkward speaking as if non-Christians are in the room because everyone's a Christian. And so you may feel uncomfortable explaining words that you think everyone understands or explaining context of biblical passages that you think everybody already knows. But here's the benefit of doing that. One is that not everybody at your church may know each other like you know them. And so when you start talking about things and explaining things that non-Christians may not know, they begin to think, oh, this is really cool. There must be non-Christians here. Also, either consciously or subconsciously, they will begin to think, hey, I can invite my friends who don't know Jesus to this church or to this place, and they will be able to follow along and understand what is happening. You see, when we preach from hey, I'm going to teach you everything, I'm going to explain everything, I'm not going to assume anything, then it kind of creates a culture of saying, hey, this is a place where people who do not know Jesus can feel welcome to come and attend. And this is why understanding your audience matters so much. Who is it that you exactly want to reach? And not even just Christians and non-Christians, but even life stages. Is there a particular context or a particular demographic that you at your church are really going hard after based on those who live near your church? Well, that should determine how you preach and the examples you use. So for example, again, preaching affecting who will come. Let's say you lead a church of older people who don't have a lot of young kids. Or let's say you lead a church of people who don't yet have kids, a lot of singles, a lot of young adults who don't have kids yet. But all of the examples that you use and all the illustrations that you use and all the teaching points that you use have to do with parents and children. Well, then that can alienate people who don't have kids and they feel like they don't belong. Not to say you can't ever use those examples, but we need to understand who is coming so that we can give relevant examples to those who are there, so that we can help connect God's truth practically to their life. Again, I think so often as preachers, we get so consumed with, and rightly so to a degree, about what the text says and what people need to know, without considering what are people walking in with? What are the season of life that they are currently in? And how can I use this text and use this truth to communicate it most effectively to them so they can walk out these doors and apply it to their life? So when we're preaching, again, we need to understand who we are preaching to, because that will determine how we preach, which means the question is, who are we preaching to? Who do you want to preach to? Because how you preach will affect who shows up. And lastly, again, how you preach affects who will come. So you have a role to play. You can actually decide who is it that we want to go after the hardest? What are the type of people that we want to go after the hardest? And you can tailor your sermons to those people so that in the context that you are in, as many people as possible can meet Jesus and grow in a relationship with him.